Hey everyone! You all voted on Instagram to see the Female Titans tutorial next, so here we are. And I don't blame you. She was my favorite project for a long time. She was created in 2018, right as I turned the corner from shaky-handed newbie to kinda confident amateur. At the time, I chose to create her because Attack on Titan is one of my favorite animes. And the Female Titan's first reveal is unforgettable. I wanted to recreate that moment, just, in doll form. So with that, it's time to take a deep dive into the past as we walk through the creation of the Female Titan. I started with a Twyla doll because I love her frame and proportions. I would need a sturdy base to capture my favorite scene, so I took my time to position and pose her, and marked in pen where her feet should go. I used regular old house nails that I hammered in from the underside of the base, and I awkwardly drilled holes in her feet to fit them. Before putting her onto the base and gluing her joints, I wanted to position her hand using super glue while I still had maneuverability. I had never done this before and wasn't even sure it would work. But I'm stubborn, so with a little bit of patience, I managed to convince her hand to stay put. I mounted her feet onto the nails and wriggled her around, supergluing joints as I went. Now that she was secure, it was time to sculpt. I wanted to create shape, but didn't want any bulk, meaning I had to apply the clay and then work it all the way back to a thin veneer. I used air-dry clay all over her body. As long as your doll is prepped well, I've never had any issues with it staying stuck once it dries. Sculpting like this isn't something that's easily taught in words. Instead, you really need hands-on practice, and this project offered me oodles of it. I was still a beginner when I made her, but I can distinctly remember how awesome it was to feel myself growing from the start of this project to the end. When laying down the muscles, I considered major muscle groups and tendons, but mostly I tried to stay true to Isayama's vision, which gave me one more reason to rewatch the anime. I worked in small sections, maybe the back of a knee, one part of the torso, around to the butt. I moved from section to section so I could sculpt slowly without time pressure. It also gave me the opportunity to return to the other sections that were almost dried, so I could smooth them over one last time with a damp brush. This meant greater control throughout my sculpting, but it also saves a lot of sanding time later. I sculpted details down her arm and all the way down to her fingers. I mapped out a rough idea for the little town she was going to stomp through, and I kept sculpting to create a natural rolling landscape over the base. Since I'd smoothed my clay as I sculpted, I didn't have to sand too much, but it's always a good idea to spend a little time sanding and smoothing your dried pieces for a clean finish. I sprayed her with 2 coats of my go-to primer to create an even base before spraying down her skin tone. Before we did any more work to her body, I was gonna have to build that little town for her to destroy. They started as lumps of alfoil that I could cover with Sculpey. Using Sculpey is very similar to air dry clay, but it doesn't create the same pasty residue and can be a little thicker or harder to work against. I followed the same steps for my Winnie windmill. I followed the same steps for my mini windmill. I was still a Sculpey noob at the time, and I accidentally roasted the heck out of my creations. Luckily, it's never made a difference other than the crispy color, so a simple coat of white paint made me feel better before getting to the real painting. To make the windmilly part of the windmill, I started with 2 matchsticks and notched one in the center so they could fit together. I sized them up and cut some tissue paper. I glued it along the edge of the matchsticks and soaked them with a bit of watered down glue, except for along the furthest edge, so that I could come back once it was dry and tear at it for that torn, aged look. With the sails finished and dried, I could glue it into place. They were adorable! I glued my little town into their places, and then I built them into the scene using a bit more air dry clay. I started painting in layers, slowly bringing the scene to life. Once I had the groundwork done, I moved on to her body. I used a deep red and applied a single coat. The slight variance in tones was something I had wanted without having to work for it. While the paint dried, I could get busy with a little bit of nature. I made some trees by winding and twisting thin wires using pliers to form a central trunk and branch them out at one end to make, well, branches. I also trimmed the loop at the base of the trunk and bent them out to create roots that I could later build into the base. I coated the wires with liquid latex and painted them. Once dry, I applied a thin layer of glue and dipped them into greenery. I experimented by making some pine trees as well, wrapping the wire around matchsticks and trying to round the corners. Then I could repeat with latex, paint, glue, and greenery. Using chalk pastels, I added some final shading over her muscles just to break up the color and add definition. Now that things were really coming together, it was FaceTime. I loved Twyla's face mold for this project. I removed her factory paint using pure acetone. To transform her into the female Titan, I would need to modify her face. I used a blade to gouge out the deepest holes, and used flexible medium gel to build up the other areas and to add some texture. I knew I could emphasize the dimension later with my painting too, so I played it safe and kept it thin. Once she was all dry, I sprayed her with primer, followed by a white undercoat, and finally her matching skin tone. This was the first time I had ever used synthetic hair for one of my dolls, and it was the first time I completely rerouted one. There were so many learning curves, like making my homemade rerouting tool. Oh gosh. I used a synthetic hair recommended for human extensions. It wasn't expensive or fancy, but I loved the color and the naturally rugged texture. After taming her mane for now, we could dive into the actual face-up. At the time, I was still prepping with Liquitex matte medium and using Faber Castelles for my face-ups, and I was still very, very new. I struggled to complete a face-up in pencils, so most of the time I just used them to draft out the face and its details before painting it over in acrylic paint. I swapped between paints and pastels to build up dimensions, tone, and shadow. Once she was perfectly scowling, I could apply one final coat of Liquitex matte varnish before glossing her eyes. Then I could undo her little tissue bonnet, so I popped her head onto her body, but I didn't glue it just yet. I used a razor to cut her hair with a feathered edge. Once I'd cut her hair back close to the correct length, then I could glue her head into position and do some final touch-ups. I was so proud of my efforts, but to bring the entire scene to completion, I would need my own little scout mid-swing. I started with a thin wire, bent into a little knot at one end to give the clay a better grip. This little guy is smaller than small. It was painful to sculpt, and even more painful to paint. But there was a hungry drive in me that knew every detail on this little guy would be appreciated by everyone who leaned in close for a good look. This will always be one of my favorite projects, so thanks to everyone who voted for it on Instagram. With one final spot of glue, the female Titan was ready to be unleashed.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel to show your support. See you next time!